So I'll be talking this evening about a group of slaves mentioned in a passage of Demosthenes. And these individuals have been lost in two senses. The first sense is literal. They perished in a shipwreck near the Crimea, the details of which I'll outline in a moment. But these individuals have also been lost to history. You won't find a history book on Greek slavery, as far as I'm aware, that discusses them or their death in any detail. And that is because the very identity of this group of drowned persons as slaves, as well as their number, depends on certain words in the Greek text of Demosthenes that were edited out of modern editions, mostly by scholars working between the 16th and the 19th century. This wasn't done for any chauvinistic reasons to do with whitewashing the Greeks. These scholars all edited the text this way for perfectly rational and respectable reasons. But what I will argue, though, is that the text is perfectly plausible as it stands in the best manuscript and doesn't require emendation. Now, I know that there's quite a broad audience here, so I don't want to take anything for granted, and we'll try and explain all the technical issues in plain, albeit Northern Irish English, as we get to them. But if I fail in this, please press me at the end to explain better anything that remains unclear. Conversely, I know that there are many in the audience who know much more than I do about the transmission of Greek manuscripts. So if I go over what seems like overly basic issues, please don't take this as condescension on my part. I just want to make sure everyone can follow the argument. Anyway, to get started, among the many tangled pieces of litigation that came before Athenian law courts in the 4th century BC, the case described in the speech against Phormio, attributed to the orator Demosthenes and dated to 327-6 BC, is of particular interest to students of both slavery and maritime history. And I'm going to treat the attribution of the speech to Demosthenes as true, simply because it doesn't affect my argument. We're dealing anyway with a genuine late 4th century law court speech from Athens. So the facts of the case are as follows. A moneylender named Chrysippus and his partner lent a merchant named Phormio 2,000 drachmas for a return trading voyage between Athens and Bosporus, not to be confused with the modern Bosporus, but an ancient kingdom centered in eastern Crimea around the Kerch Straits in the town of Pantikapaeum. Phormio spent the sum on trade goods and provisions for the journey. Chrysippus's loan to Phormio was recorded in a written contract that was deposited with the banker Kitos. And the contract secured the loan on a cargo worth 4,000 drachmas. So Phormio seems to have had other resources to draw upon, and he also seemed to have contracted further loans with other lenders for the same voyage. Phormio chartered space on a ship whose master, or Naukleros, was a man named Lampus, who was probably a freedman or possibly a slave, but one of the two anyway, at the time of the events in question. And he was working on behalf of another man, Dion, who was either his owner or his former owner. Now, for a merchant or emporos to charter space on another person's ship, and for that ship to carry the cargoes of several emporoi, merchants, who would travel on the same ship, it was a fairly common practice at the time, and Lampus surely conveyed other cargo in his vessel. Now, after arriving at the Bosporan kingdom, Phormio was meant to sell his goods and then use the profits from that sale to buy another cargo, which would then be loaded onto the same ship for the return voyage to Athens, to Piraeus. And the profits from the sale of this return cargo would be used to repay the loan plus interest, and Phormio would pocket the remainder. When the ship arrived at its destination, Phormio found that war had erupted between the Spartacid monarch Pyrrhosides I, who ruled over the Bosporan kingdom, and the nomadic Scythians who lived in the hinterland beyond his borders. And you can see here in the map the changing extent of that kingdom over the course of that dynasty. It was smaller in our time, and you can see where the Scythians are located too. So as a result of this war, nobody wanted to buy Phormio's merchandise. Business wasn't good for his end. And when Lampus was ready to set off back to Athens and asked Phormio to load his return cargo, the latter replied that he could not, because he needed the money from the sale of his outward cargo to buy his return cargo, and having failed to sell his outward cargo, didn't have the money to buy the return cargo. So he was temporarily stuck in Bosporus. he told Lampus to sail on without him, and he would return then in another ship after he had concluded his business. For Lampus, business had been much better, and he had loaded a return cargo and was eager to depart. Chrysippus narrates to the court what happened next. And this is section 10 of the speech, and I present here the Oxford Classical Text of W. Rennie. Do remember that name, we'll come back to that, and a translation, which I'll just read the translation. After this, men of Athens, this man, so we're talking about Phormio here, this man had been left behind in Bosporus, whereas Lampus, having put out to sea, suffered shipwreck not far from the port. For although his ship, as we hear, was already more fully loaded than was proper, he also loaded 1,000 hides on deck, for which reason the loss of the ship occurred. And he himself got to safety aboard the tender, along with the other slaves of Dion. But he caused the destruction of more than 30 free persons, besides the rest. And there was much grief in Bosporus when they learned of the destruction of the ship, and everyone was calling this man Phormio fortunate, in that he neither sailed back nor put anything aboard the ship. And this same account tallied with that of other persons, as well as of this man. So again, we're talking about Phormio. So that both Phormio and Chrysippus agreed about the facts of this particular event, at least. And if you read the speech, you'll see directly after this passage, witnesses are called to confirm it. It means that we can trust the basic outline of what's reported here. Unfortunately, for present purposes, we can stop here and do not need to pursue the rest of the lawsuit, which is far from straightforward. However, it's worth noting, for it will become relevant later, that Lampus too eventually got on the wrong side of Chrysippus and comes in for much criticism later in the speech. So you'd be wondering where this promised cargo of slaves is in this passage, but the passage takes on a different complexion when we consider the several manuscript readings that lie behind Rennie's Oxford OCT edition. And here a few preliminary remarks are needed about the manuscripts of Demosthenes. So Demosthenes' speeches were of course in wide circulation in antiquity, and his nephew Demochares probably played a role in publishing them, according to Professors Canfora and Cannavaro, after Demosthenes' death in 322. Their popularity owed mainly to Demosthenes' reputation as a rhetorician. The ancients held him as a model of persuasive argumentation. These speeches were copied and recopied over the centuries, but we don't have the full set of copies from every stage of the transmission chain. Most copies are lost. But the speeches continue to be copied well into the Middle Ages, and our earliest surviving manuscripts date from then. Scholars call the earliest and best manuscript S, letter S, okay? And S dates from the 9th or 10th century AD. Okay. There are other early manuscripts too, such as Y, A, and F, all from the 10th century, and Q from the 11th century. These are called the primary manuscripts. And of course, there are various later inferior manuscripts. But if you think of the chain of copying and recopying that lies between any one of these primary manuscripts and the original edition or Urexemplar that circulated in Athens in the late 4th or early 3rd century BC, then it should come as no surprise that human error led to changes and corruptions in the text over time. When a modern editor is faced with the task of producing an authoritative edition of Demosthenes' text, or text attributed to Demosthenes, he or she is confronted with a series of different manuscripts of the same speech that may preserve different wording here and there, and the editor must therefore choose which variant is the most likely one to have been written by the original author. So let's consider the manuscript readings for our passage. And our speech, the Against Phormio, is contained in in a certain number of the primary manuscripts here, S, F, and A, and Q, 4 of them. The first major alarm bell that must go off is that none of these primary manuscripts read Triaconta 30, the figure 30 in the passage we just looked at isn't there. S, the most authoritative, has Triacosia 300, as do all the others apart from A, which is Diacosia 200. The emendation to 30 first appears in an edition of Demosthenes' orations from 1570 by the French scholar Denis Lambin, aka Dionysius Lambinus. Although the image here isn't particularly crisp, but you can see that Lamban has struck through the triacosia, the 300, in the beginning of line 18 on the left, and added on the right-hand side a marginal correctio of triaconta 30. And what is more, manuscript A of the primary manuscripts, it's the only primary manuscript that includes the word eleuthera, or free. The word is omitted in the other primary manuscripts, and from a purely editorial viewpoint, then we might be surprised that Rennie chose to replace the figure 300 with the figure 30 and to include the word for free. So to understand these choices, we must look at earlier critical editions of the text. Johann Jakob Reiske, in his edition of 1770, retained the reading 300 of manuscript S, but also included the word eleuthera, free, found only in manuscript A. Emanuel Becker, in the fourth volume of his Oratores Attici, 1823, followed S by retaining the figure 300 and omitting the word free. The Reverend Charles Penrose, in his Select Private Orations of Demosthenes of 1843, a volume aimed, as you can see, at schoolboys, did the same. However, Gottfried Schäfer, in his annotation to this passage in the fourth volume of his Apparatus Criticus et Exegeticus ad Demosthenem of 1827, accepted the inclusion of the word free for reasons that are entirely obscure. And based on this choice, he then wrote that both 300 and 200 were unbelievably large numbers of free persons to have fitted aboard an ancient Greek merchant ship, alongside the rest, whom he took to be slaves. It would appear that Schäfer was objecting to the idea of well over 300 souls aboard, slave and free. He then brought forward an a fortiori argument to cast further doubt on the numbers, 300 and 200. If, as he argued, warships of the time could only carry 120 men, which isn't true, by the way, but let's just go along with them, it would be improbable to suppose that several times that number could have fitted aboard a merchantman. Schäfer concluded that 30 was the more probable figure. Now, some convoluted reasoning here, but Schäfer's criticism of the numbers in the main manuscripts was accepted by J.F. Stevenard in his popular translation Œuvre complète de Démosthène d'Échine, published in 1842, who printed the reading 30. Variants on the idea recur today. In his recent translation for the University of Texas Press's An Oratory of Classical Greece series, the late Professor Douglas McDowell wrote, and I quote, "The manuscripts all say either 300 or 200, but such high figures seem incredible, and the emendation 30 is generally accepted," end quote. Anyway, by the late 19th century, the debate had apparently been settled regarding the numbers, and the only disagreement since then has been on the question of including or omitting the word eleuthera, or free. As we've seen, Rennie's OCT of 1921 prints both 30 and free. Louis Gernet's Boudet edition of 1954 does the same. Diltz's recent Oxford Classical text of 2008, a replacement for Rennie's, prints 30, but omits the word for free. So it's vital to grasp these different editorial choices stem not from some fine point of philology, but from what makes most historical sense in context. And it really boils down to this. Is it credible that over 300 or maybe 200 persons could have been aboard Lampus's ship? And no matter which number we opt for, should we read just somata, the Greek word means bodies, or somata eleuthera, free bodies, that is, free persons? For if we follow manuscript S in the way Emanuel Becker did in his edition of 1823, the reading produces a radically different meaning. So here's what we had before. Rennie's text again with his Apparatus Criticus and a translation, okay, where you've got the 30 and the free. And if we flip to this and go back to the manuscript reading in S, is different. So Lampus got away from the ship. He got to safety aboard the tender with the other slaves of Dion because of the destruction of more than 300 bodies besides the rest. The word somata on its own in Greek can mean slave, and besides the rest, horis ton allon, must on this reading mean besides the rest of the cargo. So, should we follow the most authoritative manuscript and accept that Chrysippus told the court in Athens that Lampus had been shipping over 300 slaves? Is the text of S believable as it stands, or ought it to be amended? In what follows, I propose to look first at the word eleuthera, free, and secondly at the question of numbers. So there seems to be no good argument for including the word eleuthera, or free. As I mentioned, S is by far the best manuscript and omits this word, as do the other primary manuscripts with the exception of A. Of the generally superior quality of S, Professor Dilts has written as follows, and I quote, "The essential appeal of S lies in the fact that it tends to have a recension that is briefer than AFY, which often have readings that are easier to comprehend and are therefore suspect, according to the principle lectio difficilio potior. If this principle is used to explain differences between S and AFY, the fuller recension of AFY is the result of an attempt to simplify the text," end quote. So what does that mean? So that remark requires a bit of unpacking for anyone unfamiliar with the technical jargon. Basically, Dilts is saying that of the primary manuscripts, S, A, F, and Y, the Greek of S is usually a bit harder to understand, and that makes it more likely to represent what Demosthenes actually wrote, or the original author actually wrote. Because when ancient and medieval copyists fiddled with the wording of the Greek text, generally they did so in a way to simplify it by adding in, for example, extra explanatory words. Basically then, S bears far fewer marks of editorial tinkering and is therefore in most cases taken to be the most reliable manuscript. And the fact that it omits the word eleuthera, or free, and only A has this, should give us pause. The word may well be in A because some copyist at some point supplied it to clarify the meaning that he thought was intended by the author. It could have originated as an intrusive gloss. So basically, you know, a marginal comment or explanatory annotation that later crept into later editions through the copyist just adding it into the main text. Two further reasons enjoin us to follow S and reject A with its inclusion of the word free. First, the phrase somata eleuthera is unusual for Greek of this period. One would expect the accusative plural eleutherus used on its own as a substantive with no mention of somata if Demosthenes were simply trying to say free persons. Secondly, in the few cases where we do find the phrase free bodies in classical Greek texts, the idiomatic word order is not somata eleuthera, but eleuthera somata. The former word order has many parallels in Greek of the Roman and Byzantine periods, but none in Greek of the classical period. And this provides a further reason, aside from the reading of S and the other primary manuscripts, apart from A, for thinking that the Ur exemplar, so the original edition of the speech, did not contain the word free eleuthera, and that its presence in A owes to a copyist's explanatory annotation at some point along the transmission chain. So on balance then, we ought to follow S and admit the word free. A related point deserves consideration. Why would there be 30 free persons on board Lampus's ship, never mind 200 or 300? They cannot all have been sailors. Given the rig of classical Greek merchantmen and the labor requirements for running such vessels, 30 plus men is an excessively large crew. And this follows even if we suppose that we're dealing with a large vessel and assume that it mounted a foresail as well as a mainsail, as in this example here from Italy. You can see the two masts and two sails. There's actually a depiction of a ship rigged this way from late archaic Attica was found by Langdon and published recently. So these didn't just exist in the Western Mediterranean. The well-known and twice reconstructed Kyrenia ship had a crew of 4. You can see only 3 there, but essentially this has been a very well excavated wreck, and the personal effects of the crew have been found, and there's 4 copies of each, essentially, so they had a crew of 4. And Patrice Pommet points out that even the large Roman grain freighter that carried 276 passengers, including St. Paul, and whose wreck on the Maltese coast is recounted in chapter 27 of the Book of Acts, probably had a crew of only about 15 sailors. The crew of Lampus's ship is more likely to be identified with the other slaves of Dion, who escaped with Lampus in the tender, for we know that ships of the period might be crewed by slaves. We have other references to this. So we need a different way of explaining why so many free persons were aboard Lampus's vessel. Could they have been fare-paying passengers? 30 would be a large number for a cargo vessel of this period, not specifically acting as a ferry boat, but not an implausibly large number. But if either of the numbers 300 or 200 found in the primary manuscripts is correct, then the idea that these people were free becomes very implausible. And that brings us to the vexed question of numbers. Is it inconceivable for 300 or even 200 persons to have fitted into a merchant ship of this period, as many editors of Demosthenes have supposed, forcing them to choose a smaller figure and alter the text? We have just noted that St. Paul sailed on a ship several centuries later, in which he was one of 276 on board. As Emmanuel Nantais notes in his recent book on the tonnage of ancient ships, this was probably a large Roman annona or grain ship whose passengers were not crammed in like slaves and had ample space. However, the fact that a ship of a few centuries later than Lampus's day could carry 276 passengers comfortably ought to warn us that the close confinement of a similar number of souls in a vessel of the late 4th century BC is far from impossible. We must now turn to the practical aspects of this problem. So for our purposes, a useful place to start is the life of Josephus, which at section 6 narrates the historian Josephus's shipwreck in the Adriatic around AD 64. Josephus claims that before foundering, the ship in which he sailed carried 600 souls who had to swim all night before some of them were rescued the following morning. Nantais has calculated that the weight of this number of passengers, plus that of their baggage, water, and victuals for the journey, will have come to at least 139.27 metric tons, and possibly as much as 164.27 metric tons. Since we are interested in just over 300 persons aboard, not 600, we may half the larger figure, which would give us 82.135 tons, and then round up a little, say, to 85 tons to cover the slightly more than 300 plus Lampus and the crew. And that would give us a maximum estimate of the total weight of Lampus, the slave crew, and over 300 other souls and the necessary water and victuals. So we must also add the weight of the hides. The northern Black Sea region was a source of all manner of skins. Herodotus in Book 4 mentions otter and beaver pelts, and Demosthenes in the Against Lacritus mentions goat hides. But the term used in our speech, bursa, may more specifically mean ox hide, and you can get an idea of the appearance of Scythian cattle from this gorgeous pectoral found in the Ukraine and probably manufactured in Crimea and dating to the same period as our speech. Now, faunal remains of Scythian cattle from the Ukraine suggest that they were a bit smaller than the top Greek and Roman breeds, and as a salted hide from a modern ox can weigh as much as 50 kilograms, though most don't, I'm allocating 30 kilograms per hide for our 1,000 Scythian ox hides as a generous maximum. We must therefore add a further 30 tons to our load, adding up to a total deadweight tonnage of 115 tons. Now we have to bear in mind that our problem involves not just a matter of weight, but of space. And since there is no reason to think that there were specialized slave ships in this period, and since live human beings cannot, obviously, be packed into the hold of a ship as tightly as amphoras or sacks of grain, however close our recent ancestors came to perfecting this grim practice in the Atlantic trade, we must make some further allowance and assume that these putative 300 plus persons would only fit into a vessel that could carry a significantly larger tonnage of grain or amphoras, even if the hold and perhaps some of the deck were filled with crouching, closely confined slaves and bonds. In technical terminology then, we're dealing not simply with a problem of cargo density, but stowage factor. Let us therefore, for argument's sake, increase our load by 75%, which gives us 201.25 tons, and for a comfortable margin, round up again to 205 tons. Were there ships in operation in the Athens-Crimea trade in the late 4th century large enough to carry such a cargo, and could Lampus have operated one? Yes. As Lionel Casson rightly remarked some 50 years ago, and I quote, "The capacity of seagoing freighters has been consistently and seriously underrated," end quote. Subsequent research, all summed up in Nante's book, has greatly improved our knowledge of this issue. One must bear in mind that in the general absence of accurate information on the dimensions of ancient hulls, it is usually impossible to calculate displacement tonnage. We must normally make do with the weight of the cargo as a proxy for the size of vessels. The weight of cargoes can be estimated from shipwreck evidence, where a full load of amphoras can be counted and its weight quantified, or from written sources that mention cargo sizes. First, then, the shipwreck evidence. We are not well served in terms of classical shipwrecks, and most that have been found are towards the smaller end of the spectrum. The Tektash Borno ship carried a cargo estimated at just 9.8 tons when it sank off Chios sometime between 440 and 425 BC. The well-preserved Kyrenia and Magan Mikhail ships, both of which have been raised, preserved, and recreated in full-scale replicas, were slightly larger. So the Magan Mikhail ship, here's the recent reconstruction, which the original sank around 400 BC off the coast of what's modern Israel, could carry a cargo of about between 12 and 13 tons. The Kyrenia ship, here is a reconstruction of that, which sank around 295 to 285 BC, but was laid down about the time the Against Formian was delivered before an Athenian court, could carry a cargo of about 23.3 tons. More formidable is the Alonissos ship of around 420 to 400 BC, which on its final voyage carried a cargo, this is where it went down, carried a cargo of amphoras reckoned by Nantes at around 130 tons, making the ship, in his view, a middling-sized vessel for its time. Moving on to written sources. Demosthenes in the Against Lacritus describes a ship that could carry 3,000 amphoras, a load weighing either 78 or 108 tons on Nantes' reckoning, and which was involved in the Athens-Crimea run via Halkidiki in the northern Aegean, around the middle of the 4th century BC. This vessel falls at the lower end of the middling category. Honorary decrees inscribed on marble stelae provide us with further information. In IG 2 cubed 1 367, Athens honors a grain trader from Cypriot Cyprus in a clutch of decrees from precisely our period, and we can see from lines 29 to 46 of this particular inscription that he was active on the Black Sea Athens route, since these lines mention that his ship was forced into port and his sails confiscated by the navy of Heraclea Pontica, a city on the southern Black Sea coast. This man twice donated to the Athenians cargoes of 3,000 medimnoi of wheat at below the market price, which Nantes reckons at 90 tons per cargo. So adding medimnos is a volume measure, 52.53 litres. And if you've got that and the you know what kind of weight is being transported, you can produce a weight estimate, which is what Nantes does. In SEG 1 361, the islanders of Samos honor a merchant called Gyges of Toroni in northern Greece for conveying a cargo of 3,000 medimnoi of wheat to its port. Depending on the kind of wheat, which is not specified in the document, Nantes estimates Gyges' cargo between 90 and 117 tons. IG 2 cubed 1 339 honors two merchants of Heraclea Pontica who delivered to Athens a cargo of 4,000 medimnoi of Sicilian wheat, computed by Nantes at perhaps 163 tons. IG 2 squared 400 honors Eucharistes for bringing one cargo of 8,000 medimnoi and another of 4,000 medimnoi to Athens. On Nantes' reckoning, this means cargoes of between 241 and 311 tons in the former case, and 120 to 156 tons in the latter. IG2 cubed 1, 1064, on his Iskron, son of Proxenos, were bringing another huge cargo of 8,000 medimnoi to Athens in the 3rd century BC. The last reference on the chart there, well, at the top end of the scale of classical era merchantmen, or the myriaphoroi, or 10,000 carriers, mentioned by Thucydides and Ctesias. And here the question lies in what precisely the unit of measurement implicit in the name is taken to be. If it is talents, 1 talent equaling about 26 kilos, then a myriaphoros could carry cargoes of up to around 260 tons. But Hermann Wallinger argued convincingly that the unit in question was the amphora, which Nantais has shown is backed up by the shipwreck evidence, meaning that a myriaphoros could carry cargoes of up to 360 tons. These were the largest merchant ships afloat before the odd super freighters built during the Hellenistic period were launched, such as Hieron of Syracuse's Syracusia, a behemoth which probably had a tonnage of a similar order to that of Admiral Nelson's ship Victory. Absolutely colossal ship. In sum, the evidence shows that freighters at the upper end of the scale for the late classical period could certainly manage to carry over 300 persons. Even freighters that, when fully loaded, could carry 100 tons less cargo than the largest ships afloat at the time could have done the job. How does this compare to slave ships of the 18th and 19th century Atlantic slave trade? The most famous of these is the Brooks, which was the poster ship for the abolition movement, and you can see why from this horrific schematic. But this picture is actually not representative of how bad things were aboard this particular vessel. The image here shows one of 2 decks used for carrying slaves and depicts only as many persons as could be stowed on board as allowed under the Dolben Act of 1788, which banned slavers from carrying more than 1 slave per ton burden of the vessel's capacity. The Brooks was estimated at 297 tons burden, but in fact she regularly carried far more slaves than 297. Indeed, on her 3rd slaving voyage in 1785-6, the Brooks carried an astonishing 740 slaves across the Atlantic. If you think that the poor individuals depicted in this schematic had hardly room to move, think of what it would be with that kind of numbers. The Brooks was, however, at the larger end of the scale. When the abolitionist Thomas Clarkson visited Bristol in 1787 to gather material for his cause, he was astonished to come across 2 little sloops that were getting ready for the Guinea trade, that is, the Atlantic slave trade. Marcus Rediker discusses these in his book, The Slave Ship, A Human History, as follows, and I quote, "One was a vessel of only 25 tons. Its master intended to pick up 70 slaves. The other was even smaller. It measured 11 tons and would take on board a mere 30 slaves. Clarkson did not believe it. He even wondered whether his informants were trying to trick him into making absurd statements about the slave trade that could easily be refuted. He learned that one of the vessels had been built as a pleasure boat for the accommodation of only 6 persons on the Severn River, and that one, if not both, were to be sold as pleasure craft after they delivered their slaves in the West Indies. Clarkson decided to measure both vessels and to ask one of his companions to find the builder of the vessels and get his measurements too. The official information corresponded with Clarkson's own figures," end quote. So these comparisons offer food for thought for our ancient Greek conundrum. Lampus's ship was surely not equipped with the twin decks and stowing platforms of the Brooks, and therefore, even if closely confined, far fewer slaves could be fitted into his ship's hold. But the tiny sloops that Clarkson saw fitted out for transatlantic slaving voyages show that astonishing numbers of persons could be crammed aboard even quite small vessels. So the comparison with 18th century slavers underscores the plausibility of the figure of 300 slaves in our primary manuscripts. The various editors of Demosthenes were therefore mistaken in thinking that the figure of 300 is just completely beyond the bounds of what's conceivable. This figure is, in fact, entirely within the range of the plausible, given the size of vessels in operation in the late 4th century BC, certainly at the top end of the scale. Could Lampus have operated a vessel large enough to ship over 300 slaves? According to Chrysippus, Lampus lent Phormio 1,000 drachmas for his voyage, so he seems to have had his own supply of capital. Later in our speech, in section 36, we find a report that when the Bosporan king, Pyrrhosiades, decreed a tax exemption for all those who would carry grain to Athens, Lampus loaded a large ship, okay, with grain on these export conditions, but conveyed it to Acanthus in northern Greece instead of to Piraeus, where he was supposed to go. Now that Lampus in this instance operated what we're told is a large ship, which we can contextualize in terms of the capacity sketched a little bit earlier, is telling. Furthermore, the fact that our ship that sank seems to have belonged, like the crew, to Dion, and the fact that Lampus was or had been a slave of Dion also points to the financial muscle of Dion lying behind Lampus's commercial ventures. So in other words, there is every reason to think that Lampus could have been operated with the sort of freighter large enough to carry several hundred individuals and closely confined. Finally, how do we explain the penthos, the grief that was apparently expressed in Bosporus, if we understand the drowned persons as slaves? Actually, this was one of the points that 19th century editors pointed to as a justification for adding the word Eleuthera to their editions. And if you recall Rennie's Apparatus Criticus earlier, he reasoned the same way. The idea being that surely the Greeks would not have made a fuss if it were mere slaves who had died. The drowned accordingly must have been free persons. But this is not an insurmountable problem. One could be cynical, as a colleague pointed out to me, since the text actually says that the grief occurred once the people in Bosporus had learned of the loss of the ship. Okay. Perhaps they were just lamenting a lost investment. My preference is for a psychologically more complex understanding of the Greeks' relationship with slavery. Although there was no equivalent in ancient Greece to the modern abolition movement, plenty of writers condemned excessive cruelty to slaves. Thus, for Herodotus, castrating a slave was an unholy act, and he tells the tale of one slaver, Panaionios of Chios, who brought condign punishment on himself and his sons by operating as a eunuch maker and trader. One of his victims later got power over him and in revenge forced him and his sons to castrate each other. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter. The attitude of Herodotus is what's interesting here. Demosthenes condemned Aeschines' apparently boorish conduct towards an enslaved Olynthian girl, and Hyperides in the Against Timandrus claimed that even slave traders were not so brutal that they would separate a family of slaves and sell them separately. Rather, they would prefer to keep them together and take a hit and make a smaller profit than do something so vile. So the Greeks had a complex and rather hypocritical attitude to slavery that allowed them to exploit and pity slaves simultaneously. In my opinion, then, it's perfectly plausible that people in Bosporus cried crocodile tears over those that they had just sold into slavery and who subsequently drowned in their hundreds. In sum, the reading of Manuscript S, which is preferable a priori anyway, should stand. Of course, Chrysippus may be exaggerating. He may be exaggerating the number of over 300 victims in order to tarnish Lampus's name, but he cannot be exaggerating into the realms of fantasy, or else he will have made himself look ridiculous before a court of Athenians who were used to seeing large freighters in Piraeus, who regularly heard in assembly meetings about the grain supply, and who passed the very honorary decrees I discussed earlier for various merchants transporting large cargoes of grain to Piraeus and selling them for less than the going rate. Chrysippus also brought, as I said earlier, witness testimony to back up his assertions about the sinking of Lampus's ship. It is unlikely that he would have gone to the trouble of bribing witnesses to corroborate this detail, which at any case was not vital to his, at any rate was not vital to his case. So we must therefore conclude that Lampus, for this voyage at least, had indeed chosen to ship slaves, and probably aboard one of the larger freighters that normally transported, for example, wine from the Aegean to the Crimea and carried a shipment of Crimean grain for the return voyage. In other words, the sort of ship that we know Lampus otherwise operated. This makes sense for another reason. 2 centuries after Demosthenes' day, Polybius pointed out that livestock and slaves were the chief products of the Black Sea, and the evidence for regular export of Black Sea slaves to Aegean Greece from as early as the 6th century BC is plentiful and not in doubt. Strabo noted that the town of Tanais, which you can see up in the upper right hand portion of the map here, located at the mouth of the River Don as it empties into the Sea of Azov, was a key export point for both hides and slaves. So exactly, in my opinion, the nature of Lampus's cargo. On their way to the Mediterranean, such exports must have passed the cluster of cities located around the Kerch Strait, which you can see here in the map, joining the Sea of Azov to the Black Sea, and therefore bypassed the exact locale where Lampus was operating. Although writing in the Augustan period, in this passage, Strabo is referring to the past and uses a verb in the imperfect tense. Indeed, a recently discovered merchant's letter dating to the 4th or 3rd century BC, written in Greek on a lead tablet and found in Kerch Bay, mentions a slave boy. Buying a cargo of slaves will have been particularly attractive to Lampus because of the war that Parasades was waging against the Scythians. I'll explain why now. We don't know the details of this war, but a good parallel can be found slightly earlier, for Xenophon in book 7 of the Anabasis recounts how, at the end of the previous century, another northern warlord, the Thracian king Seuthes II, took him on a slave raid. They captured and burned an enemy village, rounding up 1,000 captives and 12,000 head of livestock, and sent these to the Greek town of Perinthus on the coast of the Sea of Marmara for sale. Unlike the Thracians, the Scythians were mostly nomadic, but a raid in a large seasonal camp can't have been that much different. A few years after Seuthes' raid, the Spartan king Agesilaus' raids in Asia Minor had so flooded local markets with booty that prices plummeted and slave traders were abandoning elderly and infant slaves by the roadside as not worth the bother of transporting to market, as discussed in a recent paper by Professor Van Wees. We know of other occasions when war had this effect on slave prices. So this point is key. Warfare generates surpluses of slaves, pushes down the price of slaves in the locale of the war, and this makes the potential profit margin for merchants who can transport those slaves bought there to a distant location where the prices haven't changed, much more attractive. So this makes Lampus's actions, as reported in Demosthenes 34:10, intelligible. With the financial muscle of Dion behind him, Lampus was not in the sort of precarious position that faced Phormyon. War was potentially disastrous for merchants like Phormyon, who counted on selling their outbound cargo and using the profits from that to buy a return cargo. But the opposite was true for those who had access to sufficient capital without worrying about getting their funds solely from selling their outbound cargo. For such merchants, war provided a golden opportunity, buying up slaves on the cheap. If we accept the reading of manuscript S, then Lampus's actions appear in just this light. He was not a regular slave trader, but an opportunist who saw that under current market conditions, he could make a greater profit in exporting slaves than in shipping a cargo of grain. Having bought a large crowd of slaves, quite likely recently enslaved war captives, he crammed these unfortunates into his ship until it was loaded more fully than was proper, as you can see in the text here. And this phrase can simply mean that every available inch of space was packed with human beings, not necessarily that the tonnage of the cargo was too great. And as I said before, given that slaves cannot be stowed as closely as sacks of grain or amphora of wine, Lampus was indeed probably shipping a lesser tonnage than was safe, meaning that his ship was riding high in the water. Furthermore, when lading the ship, he may have left room for Phormyon's putative cargo, which, as we've seen, Phormyon was unable to provide. And it may be for these reasons that, instead of properly ballasting his ship, Lampus added the cargo of hides to weigh down the vessel and thus reduce the freeboard, that is the distance between the waterline and the deck. And these hides have the advantage of being saleable, whereas proper ballast may or may not have been saleable, depending on what was available. Perhaps millstones or the like. We know these were used for ballast on the Kyrenia ship. Maybe these weren't available to Lampus at the Crimea, or perhaps he did not like the idea of wasting valuable space by ballasting his ship with sand and stones. However, by stowing the hides on deck, he raised the ship's center of mass, exacerbating its pitch and roll once it left harbor. When the ship listed too far and started to take on water, Lampus and the crew escaped on the tender, but the human cargo, many perhaps chained in the hold, went to a watery grave. If this interpretation is correct, then it provides a precious testimonium for the sea transit phase of the ancient Greek slave trade, about which we're pretty much otherwise uninformed, as well as the role of enslaved sailors and merchants in running its supply lines. It also illustrates what has hitherto been expected on the basis of guesswork, that in the ancient Greek world, slaves usually traveled as part of mixed cargoes and not on specialized vessels. But above all, it shows the fatal consequences of Lampus's greed. Like the freedman turned slave trader Aulus Coprelius Timotheus, who transported couples of slaves down to the North Aegean coast several centuries later, Lampus's background as a former slave, or a slave or former slave, seems not to have occasioned any reservations about trafficking in human beings, nor does his apparent inexperience in this line of business seem to have worried him sufficiently to ship his usual, but in this case less profitable, cargo of grain. His gamble sent perhaps hundreds of souls to a miserable death. Thank you very much for your attention.